I had the pleasure of sitting down with New York Times best-selling author C.J. Box. His new novel, Stormwatch, is currently on bookshelves everywhere. He is the author of the acclaimed Joe Pickett series as well as Cassie Duell series. Both are also the subject of TV series as well. Joe Pickett is currently streaming on Paramount Plus, while Big Sky is currently on ABC. CJ and I discuss his inspirations, working in Carbon County, what he reads, and his process. Without further ado, here's the interview with CJ Box. So I am interviewing author CJ Box about his career and his current novel that is out. And I'm just going to jump right into it here. CJ, welcome. And first off, why don't you give me a little background on what it was like growing up for you in Carbon County?
Sure. Well, first of all, thanks for hosting me. I didn't grow up in Carbon County. I grew up in Natrona County. I'm a Casper boy. But I was the editor of the high school newspaper at Kelly Walsh High School. And we won a bunch of national awards for investigative reporting and some other things. And I think as a result of that, I got a scholarship in mass communications journalism to the University of Denver, which is a pretty hoity-toity private school, but the scholarship was such that I could go there cheaper than I go to the University of Wyoming. So I went there. I graduated in 81, and my first job out of college, I was looking for a journalism career, and my first job out of college was at the Saratoga Sun newspaper. So I went from Casper to Denver to Saratoga, and I was really charmed by it because the publisher at the time, Dick Peru, the interview took place in a boat. We floated the North Platte River and caught fish and drank beer. And by the end of that, by the time we reached town, I was sold, and I would have probably paid him to work there. So I started as a general kind of reporter for the Saratoga Sun, meaning I did everything. I think the first or second day on the job, I had to go interview a kid and take pictures of his 4-H champion cow. And so it was quite a kind of a culture shock from, journalism training to doing that. But as a result of that job, I was able to get really ensconced in Saratoga, at least the Valley, primarily. And so I was in, Saratoga encampment, Rollins, had some friends at the Daily Times at the time, and really fell in love with the area. It ticked every box for me. I'm a fisherman, I'm an outdoorsman, I like to hunt, but I think the biggest thing was just kind of the culture of the Valley primarily, is that it's a combination of so many different things that I like. One being it is real still working cowboy, working ranch area, but it's also kind of resorty at the same time. It's some of the wealthiest people. I'd never met a millionaire until I lived in Saratoga. Then I met multimillionaires and then billionaires. And but at the same time, the town itself is more working class, blue collar, touristy, but not touristy to the point that it's fake, like so many resort areas. So I fell in. I like the people there. I like the people here. We are still part of the community. My wife Lori and I, a lot. Even though it took a long time to get back. I'm on several boards. She's on the Chamber of Commerce board. And, we like to be involved in things. And one of the great things about my writing career, how well it's gone, is that we could have lived anywhere. We could have just pulled up stakes and moved anywhere in the whole country or world, because you can write from anywhere. But by being able to choose, we chose to come back to the Valley, which we'd always had a place here at a cabin in Riverside for a while. And we were able to find a small ranch south of Saratoga that's perfect for us and my wife's horses. And I don't see ever. I still meet people around town sometimes who say, when are you going to move to Hollywood or something like that? And that is the last thing I would ever do.
Yeah, I can kind of understand that. I'm from Denver originally and moved up here to take the job. So having lived in an urban area like Denver, which has millions of people now, and then moving up to rural Wyoming, it's quite a culture shock. But I don't know, within a week of living here, I was like, I kind of like this. Get away from the daily hustle and bustle of a major city. So I kind of feel that as a big influence. So of course you kind of talked about this a little bit, but how did the environment of Saratoga, Carbon County, Natrona County, you're growing up in Wyoming, how did that influence your current writing and your characters?
Well, there's a lot of answers to that question. After working at the newspaper, and I still have maintained a column that was in several newspapers in Wyoming. But I went to work for Wyoming AAA. So I was the road service guy for the state of Wyoming, moved to Cheyenne, and traveled the whole state like crazy. I was in every little town because every little town has AAA road service. But then following that, I went to work for the state of Wyoming in tourism. It was then called the Wyoming Travel Commission. It's now the Department of Tourism. But my job there was manager of global development, meaning I traveled the world working with tour operators and travel agents in Europe and Asia, Scandinavia, Australia, New Zealand. And then from that started a company with my wife to promote inbound international tourism on behalf of 5 Western states. And we had offices I think we had 7 offices at one point, most of them in Europe and then Scandinavia and also Australia. And our job was to promote inbound. We worked with the travel industry, not with individual tourists. But part of my job was to tour operators and journalists from overseas around the state and around the region. And that's when I started to realize I could see this area, this place, through their eyes, and things that I had grown up with that I just didn't think that much about. I realized how unique things were. I remember seeing a bunch of French journalists smoking cigarettes, walking. We stopped at a rest area in the Bighorns, and they walked away from the rest area and walked straight into an elk camp where there was hanging elk in it, and it scared the crap out of them because there's dead animals hanging from the trees. What kind of place is this? And so all these little unique things that I could kind of see through their eyes, things like snow fences. I can then incorporate into books so that they were unique and authentic to the area, and I still try to do that.
Going back to what I was talking about, in Colorado, even going up the major highways and stuff and in the mountains, we don't have snow fences. And I felt like an idiot seeing these fences along the road and asking the first person, like, what are those? And like, they're snow fences. And I was like, what do you need those for? And then it wasn't, of course, until this winter when I realized, yeah, it's probably useful.
Yes, very useful. Yeah.
But kind of getting into your process. So authors have their own ways of writing and their process, and kind of what is your process? And then do you have several storylines plotted out for the next books, or do you just focus on the next novel and see where that specific story goes?
I keep the same method that I used for the very first book, which is open season, which is now 23 years old. And it's worked for me, and I'm not going to change. And it's every author works differently, I've found. But I always start with 1 or 2 and sometimes 3 kind of hot button issues, things that people are talking about, like the post office. And they're generally always resource-based to some degree, but sometimes they're big things like, energy development, wind energy, environmentalism, eco-terrorism, things that affect us here on the ground. And then with those 2 or 3 topics, I just research the heck out of them. And then in my mind, the way I always look at it is, how can I, once I've got these things figured out, the most current novel, Stormwatch. So there's a lot of things going on. There's shed hunting in there, which has become quite a thing in the West, the Rocky Mountain West in Wyoming, but also kind of environment, extremism on both sides that's leaking through. So I research that, and then the way I look at it is, how can I pull a reader through these issues in a page-turning way? Then I start an outline, and I kind of do a bullet point outline all the way from chapter 1 through the end, and then a little list of new characters and recurring characters. How old are they? What happened in the last novel? Where are they now? And then I just start writing literally on top of the outline. And I try to do, when I'm really going about, at least minimum of 1,000 words a day, which is not that many really. And then just keep pushing to the end till I get a big first draft, and then go back and refine it and edit it some more, and edit it again. And then my wife gets it, my first reader, and she is a very good editor. And then I make take her notes, changes. Then it goes out to my 3 daughters, and they all send notes. Then it goes to my agent in New York, and she may or may not send notes. And then it goes to the publisher. So that's the process. And each time I may have an ending in mind, the entire novel, and get to the end and change it. Or it may go a direction that I never anticipated that I like, and go that way. So I'm not rigid to the outline, but for me it works. I never sit down and look at a blank screen in the morning and think, what am I going to write today? So I always have that outline in front of me.
Do you and other authors kind of collaborate or talk about your different processes or any of that kind of thing, and bounce ideas off each other? Like, hey, I'm stuck on this part of the novel and how the story goes. Just for example, if Stephen King, what would you do with this story? I don't know if you even know Stephen King, but just kind of other authors and how you work that out, or is it just a solitary solo writing process?
It's pretty solitary. I don't know Stephen King, but he knows me. He's a big fan of the books, and has tweeted out several times. And he was a big fan of the TV show Big Sky. For a while, he said thought it was the best thing on television. So he reads my stuff. I know that, but I don't know him well. There are other authors, though. It's not so much process kind of things with other authors. You tend to talk more about the business part of it, agents, editors. Advances, what publishers are doing, what editors to steer clear of, that kind of thing. But and what books people are reading. That's one thing in publishing. They really do read books, and they like to talk about books. And whenever you get together over drinks or dinner with publishing people and or other authors, you talk about books.
That makes sense. Just kind of like business side of it, rather than, I hold myself up in a cabin and smoke 20 cigars and drink a bottle of whiskey and finish out my novel kind of stuff.
Exactly.
Have you always been a fan of the Western genre?
Yes, to some degree, yes, because when I grew up in Wyoming, as a kid, I tried to read everything I could find that was either written about Wyoming or history or the Mountain West or the West in general. I've never been the biggest fan of like traditional Westerns. That's what, for example, I'm a member of Western Writers of America. And what I write is nothing like what most of that organization, they are writing traditional 1880s Westerns. I don't do that. I don't think I could do that. But I've always been fascinated with books about the region and the state. And I try to incorporate, some Western history into nearly all of the books, and some of them much more so, that are actually like retelling of the Tom Horn story, but in modern day, that kind of stuff. So I use that and work with that, but I've never written a traditional Western and read very few of them, really.
And then if you weren't a, I guess, for lack of a better term, modern Western writer or part of the Western, is there any genre that you would like to write about, like sci-fi, fantasy, modern fiction, crime, that kind of thing? I mean, there is some crime based in your novels, but, you know, aside from that, you know, like high fantasy, Lord of the Rings, sci-fi, that kind of stuff?
I can't conceive of writing fantasy. That doesn't mean I won't read it, and I don't appreciate it when it's done well, but it's not something I would tackle. You know, my books are sometimes shelved in either their Western, thriller, mystery, or crime police procedurals. So I think it's all of those different genres right there. And then I also, in addition to the Joe Pickett novels, written Cassie Duell series, and then a couple of standalones that don't really relate to either one of them. That would be probably considered more thrillers or psychological thrillers. So, but I never sit down and say, I'm going to write a psychological thriller. I just have a story or an idea in mind and go from there. And it's not until the book is done that somebody says, oh, this is a psychological thriller or whatever. I never try to write to a genre or to a specific audience.
Makes sense. And then when you read on your own, you're talking about authors talking about books and reading other books and consuming that. What is your favorite genre besides, you know, you were talking about history and stuff. So if you were just to sit down on a random Tuesday night and just crack a book, what do you think it would be?
Oh, that's a good question and a tough question. I read a lot of, you know, mystery, police procedural type books because I get sent a lot of them. That's one thing about this. New authors especially want blurbs for the cover, you know, by a New York Times notable name on the front or the back. So I read a lot of those, but a lot of them are books I wouldn't choose. I just have taken on that assignment. I read very widely, really. Read a lot of history, both, you know, American and international. I read anything. Whenever I hear or read a review of, or somebody recommends a book that may be way out of what I would normally choose, I'll take it on. Because I want to read widely, because I think that I'm curious, but I also think I learn things that I can later use in my own writing by reading outside of the genre as much as possible. Right now I'm reading Napoleon by Andrew Roberts, which has nothing to do with anything I'm ever going to write, but I like it.
I'm the same way. I just read this biography on Jesse James, and then I switched it. I'm reading a book on the Crusades. So it's kind of like a totally different realms there.
I think it's good to read widely and not get stuck in it, even though, of course, I want people to read my books and consider it a genre, but I think it's better if they read more widely.
And then who personally is your favorite author, and which authors currently or that are no longer with us inspire your writing?
My favorite author for years and years and years has been Thomas McGuane, who writes, I guess he would be categorized as literary novelist, but to me, he just writes beautifully about fishing, horses, living in the West, lives in Montana, has a little ranch. He's getting old now, and he only writes short stories, and he writes collections, but as a stylist, he's just unmatched, in my opinion. He's still my favorite. And beyond that, I have a list of, I think, 35 authors because people always ask, who do you read? Who are your favorite? And whenever they ask that, I draw a blank. So I made a list that's on my website, but it goes from classics to contemporary fiction to, you know, historians, in my particular genre, I would say my favorites are Michael Connelly, John Sanford, Denise Mina is another one. And then outside that genre, Cormac McCarthy, just A.B. Guthrie. It's pretty eclectic, but it's a big, wide range.
Yeah, Cormac McCarthy is one of my favorites. Blood Meridian is one of my favorite books of all time, and that one's
the most terrifying book I've ever read.
Oh my gosh, it's brutal.
I was asked a few years ago, who is the not worst, but scariest fictional character you've ever read? And I said the judge from Blood Meridian.
Oh, definitely. Like that book freaks me out. And it's one of those ones that you know what's going to happen, but you just can't stop reading it. And it's just it just like rocks you to your core. And that's what I think makes a good book, honestly. So we kind of touched on this a little bit. And so kind of with this emergence of modern or the neo-Western movement with McCarthy with No Country for Old Men, series such as Justified, Yellowstone, all its sequels. Did that kind of play into the creation of Joe Pickett at all in particular? Did that have any influence on that?
Not really, because at the time I started writing what would later become Open Season, I called it Joe Pickett. There wasn't any movement going on. That was 23 years ago. That was actually 28 years ago when everybody said the Western was dead. So I never thought consciously about writing a Western. I thought it was more of a contemporary Western novel, but more by the location than the themes. Now, things have come around. I think probably they're about ready to peak again and go away. But Yellowstone made a big splash. No one saw it coming. But there's a lot of really good, very literate writing that once would have been considered just regional. That is, considered very highly, like Cormac McCarthy's stuff. You can't really say that's a Western. Those are Westerns, but they're thrillers. They're literary thrillers set in the West. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm a big Justified fan, and I've read several of the Fire in the Hole books by Elmore Leonard. So, Can
I interrupt for just 1 second?
Oh, sure.
One of the best things, you were asking about process. One of the best things I've ever read, and I still look at it, is Elmore Leonard wrote for the New York Times his 10 rules of writing. I don't know if you've ever seen that. Mm-hmm. The number one rule is never start a book with weather. So Stormwatch, the recent book, starts with a huge blizzard storm. But he kind of says, don't ever start a book with weather unless you can do it and do it really well. And so anybody who's trying to figure out how to write or what to write, look up Elmore Leonard's 10 rules.
Were Joe Pickett and Cassie Duell, were they inspired by real people per se?
Not particularly like a person. Joe Pickett was more for Joe Pickett, I just wanted kind of like a contemporary Western everyman. That one of the reasons his name is Joe is I thought average Joe, somebody who is dedicated to his job, works hard, loves his family, not necessarily the sharpest knife in the drawer, but who's very dogged when he gets into something. He's based on not a person, but a type. And I've met over the years an awful lot of game wardens who could be Joe Pickett. And it's been weird. I met him after I created the character. And I've since met game wardens that could be Joe Pickett. Cassie Duell is more of a type as well, as opposed to based on any one person in particular. None of the primary protagonists, Joe Pickett or Cassie Duell, are based on a person. They're more based on a type, a Western archetype, primarily. Joe Pickett could be any game warden, and I've met a lot of game wardens who could be Joe Pickett, who had the same family situation, same dedication to the job, and so on. So it's more of a type. There's Very few characters in any of the books are based on real people. One exception to that in the Joe Pickett series is a character named Nate Romanowski, who's very popular with a lot of readers, who's an outlaw falconer with a special forces background who carries one of the largest handguns in the world. And he's based on a friend of mine who's still around. And I used to go falconry hunting with him. I learned everything about falconry from him. And I incorporated that character without realizing how popular he'd become. But like I said, he wants us to come up and help him brand cows on his ranch in a couple of weeks. And my wife and I don't want to ride around like cowboys anymore. We're too old.
Yeah, Nate Romanowski, that's actually my dad's favorite character.
Yeah.
So it's funny you bring that up. How far do you think these characters will go? Just till the end of time, or do you want to move away from them ever, or...
No, I don't want to move away. There's been a natural progression, especially in the Joe Pickett series, because those books take place in real time. In the very first book, open season, Joe Pickett is 32 years old. And there's been a book a year, usually a year between books, and a year. Every character is older by a year. So, not always. Sometimes they're back to back. Sometimes they're 4 months apart. But I've tracked that. And in the current novel Stormwatch, he's 51. So there will be a natural time when, he's going to want to retire, which is probably going to time out with when I do. I never think more than one book ahead, and ever. And sometimes I write myself into corners because I'll have something happen at the end of a book, and then the next book I have to address it, and I don't know what I'm going to do. But I think it's still better to write one at a time rather than look ahead and try to fill in the blanks to get to a conclusion of some kind.
Yeah, one of my favorite series of books, it's by Bernard Cornwell, and it's called... it's the Last Kingdom book series.
Right. We watched the TV show.
One of my
I have not read the books, I have to admit.
I'm about 7 or 8 into them, and there's about 15 of them. And they follow the main character Uhtred through his life. Mm-hmm. And I kind of liken that to Joe Pickett, how it's kind of different stages of his life as the books go on. But yeah, that's kind of what I was thinking of. So it's now been a made-for-TV series. And then how has that experience been being a producer instead of an author on a TV show? It's
very interesting, and it really depends on the TV show and the people involved. There's no one way it works. Big Sky, we're waiting to find out now if it's going to be renewed for a 4th season. I don't know. But those, because that's a big broadcast network production, is much different than Joe Pickett, which is on a smaller scale. ABC, the people involved there, David E. Kelley was the guy who brought Big Sky to life, and he wrote the first 5 or 6 episodes of season 1, which are excellent. I say they're excellent because it's stuck to the book, called The Highway. It's really creepy. It was a big hit, and then that's what he does. He introduces shows and steps away. And the writers that came in kind of rocketed through the rest of the books in the Cassie Duell series in just a few episodes and ran out of books. So now they're doing their own thing with the characters I created, but not with the stories I wrote. So that's different. I watch it and I don't know what's going to happen. And I wonder why sometimes things do happen. So the best thing about the TV series, both of them, is that it's introduced a lot of people to the books who wouldn't have ordinarily have picked them up. But Joe Pickett is much closer to the books, and I'm really proud of it and really like it. The first season was based primarily on the first book, Open Season, with a little bit of the third book, Winterkill, thrown in. The second season, which we just previewed in advance last week, it'll be start on June 4th, is basically 3 of the books: Blood Trail, Nowhere to Run, and what's the other one? Force of Nature. And they're combinations of those 3 books throughout the entire season, and I think it's excellent.
Cool. So when you see your characters on TV, does it feel weird kind of giving up some of that creative direction for the character?
Not really, because I knew what I was getting into in the first place. I've talked to enough authors over the years who've had books and movies based on their books. Some of them are horrified what happened. Some of them are really pleased with what's happened. I've always looked at it as don't look at it as a TV show. Look at it as 1 hour commercials for your books, and how close are they to them. And yeah, there are things, sometimes they cast people that I would never envision in that part, but that's just part of the process. I mean, nobody held a gun to my head and made me cash those checks. I knew what I was getting into, and if they stick close to the source material and they're successful, then I'm successful too.
Nice. Yeah, I kind of think of George Martin with how Game of Thrones got so popular, and then it kind of filmed itself into a corner, and he's got all that stuff. So,
well, one of the most amazing things about Hollywood that is incomprehensible to me is why they would buy a series of books, because they're popular and the subject matter appeals to them, and then change everything in them when it comes to the screen. I know there's a million reasons: casting, timing, political correctness sometimes, but it amazes me that they deviate so far from the books when that's the reason they're doing it, is the books in the first place.
Yeah. So I've got a couple of questions from Joe Pickett fans. So my curator, Andrew, has been crushing through the series. I think he's read about 10 or 12 in the last couple months. And he wanted to know, when Joe got the new dog, they got a corgi. And was that inspired by any dog in particular?
Yes. That is kind of a fun thing. Joe Pickett has always owned the same dogs that my wife and I have had, and the same names even. And when Maxine, the first Labrador, got too old and died, at the time my wife got a corgi, which I didn't even consider a dog, but I've come to really like him. So I made a corgi hybrid lab mix in the books named Tube that is introduced. He must be right at that point. Later on, Joe Pickett gets another Labrador named Daisy, which is what we have right now. So yeah, I've kept close to the dogs. So yes, the answer is he gets another Labrador, just like most game wardens you see have Labradors in their pickups.
And are those the actual names of your current dogs too?
They are.
Tube?
We don't have a Tube. No, I just made that up. But we did have a Maxine, and now have a Daisy.
Tube is a funny name. And then another one we had was, do things that Joe runs into as a game warden actually happen, and how often are these types of cases occurring?
Well, I guess the best way to answer that is, you have to suspend disbelief for any kind of long series like this, where there's lots of incidents and lots of murders. And, most game wardens never run across a murder investigation. Some do, though. So some of the incidents in the books are based on real game warden things. Some are not. For example, on the current, the book called Blood Trail and the book called Force of Nature, and those are Nowhere to Run particularly starts out with an incident where the game wardens encounter a pair of like 6'5" brothers way up in the mountains that are living in a pup tent and obviously doing crimes to live off the land, and scare the crap out of the game wardens. That's based on a real game warden incident that happened in the Wind River Mountains. I've talked to both game wardens who encountered these brothers, and I took that and ran with it, and that begins season 2 of the show. And the brothers that they hired for the TV look exactly like the photos of the brothers that these game wardens saw 20 years ago. It's really kind of amazing. But yeah, there's some strange encounters. I try to incorporate real game warden incidents, but I also weird thing with fiction. Sometimes if you use the actual story as it happened, it sounds too outrageous for the page. So a lot of times I have to scale the stories back to make them believable.
Yeah, we have a story here in Carbon County. Actually, and I could be getting some of the details wrong, but basically, there was a POW camp, World War II, and there were a bunch of German soldiers there, and one of them escaped, and I think it was I can't remember if it was game wardens or Fish and Wildlife, but they were tracking this guy down, and the guy ended up killing him.
I'm aware of this story.
And there were these wild stories about how he was actually just a German spy, and not sure if he was actually in the POW camp, but it is kind of crazy what
I've read those stories,
yeah.
and I've incorporated a little bit of that story in a couple of the books. But again, that's one of those that if you wrote about a game warden encountering a German spy in Carbon County, Wyoming, and getting shot by him, most readers would say, "Oh, come on," So you have to sort of change these things.
That's what's great about history, though. Like, can really happen. The weirdest things can happen anywhere. But, well, that's all I had. I really appreciate you coming in and speaking with us. And, yeah, if you haven't checked out Stormwatch, should be in any bookstore you look for. And thanks again.
And it was debuted at #1 on the New York Times for hardcover fiction and #1 for combined fiction and ebooks, and hung on the list for 7 weeks. So it's done well.
Congratulations.
Thanks.
Well, thanks again. I appreciate you coming in, and we'll talk again sometime.
Okay, this is fun.
Thanks again to CJ Box for visiting us here at the Carbon County Museum and sitting down for the interview. If you like this video, hit the thumbs up button and subscribe to the Carbon County Museum channel for more great historical content about Carbon County. Thanks again for watching.